Welcome to you all. Welcome to this fourth session of the City of London Green City Briefings. I'm Audrey Tim. I am Technical Advisor to the International Association of Horticultural Producers. The City of London Green City Briefings are a series of 8 free of charge, 1-hour webinars launched to address the climate change topics that the City of London faces and that are relevant to cities around the world. Together with the Worshipful Company of Gardeners, AIPH prepared the series of briefings with the very welcome support of the City of London. The briefings are only one of the activities in the AIPH Green City programme. We recently launched the AIPH World Green City Awards. These awards recognise significant achievement and leadership in making cities more resilient and livable, using plants and nature at the core of city form and function. Online entries are now open, and we invite all cities to showcase their bold and innovative action. Entries close in March 2022, and for more information, you can follow the link posted in the chat. So on with the briefings to hear some of the latest advances. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Jennifer McKelvie. Jennifer is the Toronto City Councillor for Ward 25, Scarborough Rouge Park, representing over 100,000 constituents in the city's most eastern riding. Before being elected in 2018, Jennifer worked as a professional geoscientist and managed research partnerships at the Nuclear Waste Management Organisation and the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. At Toronto City Council, Jennifer serves as chair of the Infrastructure and Environment Committee. In that capacity, she is taking an active role in the City of Toronto's climate change, resilience and ravine strategies. Jennifer will lead this briefing session. Over to you, Jennifer.
Well, good morning, bonjour, hello. Thank you so much, Audrey, for the kind invitation to be here today and to be the MC for this very important conversation about the intersection between built infrastructure, well-being, and nature. I know that we are meeting in different locations around the world today, but I would like to start by acknowledging that the land I am meeting with you on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunees, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis people. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today's conversation has fabulous timing. It was just released this morning, the C40 Urban Nature Declaration to restore, expand, and create green and blue spaces in our cities. And importantly, all of Toronto, Paris, and London are signatories to this urban declaration. In Toronto, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've certainly seen that we need more green space. As we face closures of businesses and recreational opportunities, Toronto residents sought refuge in our green spaces and recognized how important they are for our mental and our physical well-being. We would certainly benefit from more green space. In Toronto, our best opportunity to provide more access to nature is in our ravine systems, which cover 17% of our land in an area of 11,000 hectares. They're beautiful, they're geologically important. We have a thick blanket of glacial sediments that have been carved down over centuries by our stream systems, and they have beautiful escarpments. But they also function as important natural infrastructure. They act as sinks for carbon, purify our water, provide a home for many species, and importantly, make us more resilient to extreme weather events that can cause flooding. If you put a dollar value on these functions of the 17% of our land, there is a ecosystem services benefit of 558 million euros annually. So this is the amount of money we would have to spend if we didn't have these green spaces. And with such a big value, it's clear that any investment has a huge return. And right now in Toronto, we have an ambitious strategy to create an additional 81 kilometer of trails through our ravine network. But we know as our population grows, our green spaces will face pressure. We will need more of them. And so Toronto is very young in the European context. We're at a point where we can't just rely on the existing green space, but we also need to start innovative solutions. And so we are very excited to hear today about the innovative solutions being proposed in Paris and London. And I look forward to hearing from our speakers. So our first speaker is Curtis, and Curtis Gubb, Dr. Curtis Gubb, is an environmental consultant at Cundall, London in the UK. Curtis holds a PhD from University of Birmingham, focusing on environmental quality and biophilia within the built environment. He has worked at Cundall since graduation, where he is an environmental consultant in the sustainability team in London. He is the curator of health and well-being workstream, focusing on bespoke reviews, certifications, biophilia, POE, and indoor environmental quality. And additionally, he delivers sustainable development frameworks and materiality reviews for various clients across numerous sectors. Curtis is also a member of both the CIBSE Knowledge Generation Panel and AIR Working Group. Curtis will join us to talk about the monitoring and assessment of well-being in the workplace and the economic benefits of including plants inside and around buildings and offices. Welcome, Dr. Gubb.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. And yes, thank you to everyone for joining us today. So today I'm going to talk about the relationship between biophilia, indoor environmental quality, and productivity. I just want to briefly discuss Cundall, where I work now. So we're a multidisciplinary engineering company. So I work in the sustainability team. We focus on health and well-being and biophilia. We've got 21 offices globally, nearly 1,000 people worldwide. And we're the first consultancy in the UK to become carbon neutral for our 1, 2, and some of our scope 3 emissions. So as I was kindly introduced before, I'm a sustainability consultant at Cundall, the health and wellbeing curator, and a Well AP. But the reason here today is prior to working at Cundall, I did a PhD at the University of Birmingham, looking at biophilia, planting indoors, and indoor air quality. And that's what I want to discuss with you today. So topics for discussion today are around indoor IEQ and what that is, and biophilia, how biophilia impacts air quality and thermal comfort, and then about productivity and well-being as well. So I just want to introduce IEQ to make sure everyone's aware of what it is. There's a lot of acronyms these days, and IEQ is an encompassing acronym that can include includes air quality, thermal comfort, and other metrics as well. So in terms of air quality, obviously that's a very wide-ranging topic with numerous different pollutants. And today I'm going to focus on CO2 and NO2 specifically. And in thermal comfort, you've obviously, again, I want to discuss relative humidity today and planting, but obviously there's a big impact around air temperature as well of plants and their cooling ability, but I'm not going to discuss that today. But separately, IEQ also includes light and noise. So I think biophilia, I think the really important thing that I've learned from the PhD, from working in industry, is that it really is a very holistic, the benefits are really holistic, and actually when they're all put together, you really see that big drive for change. But there is benefits from air quality, benefits from the well-being, productivity, and then outdoors as well, ecologically. All of this has economic impacts and impacts our well-being. So it's really important to look at biophilia in an encompassing and a holistic way, and not focus on particular attributes, and that overall thing really provide where the benefits can really be seen. So in terms of air quality, as I said, I really want to discuss CO2 and NO2, and then some experiments that I did during my PhD and sort of the research and where this is currently. So just to talk about CO2 first, ambient concentrations, I think we're all aware, are rising. We're going to be exposed to higher and higher concentrations naturally over the next 100 years or so. Currently this sits at 420, and it's predicted to be up at 600 parts per million by 2100. So the problem's really not going away. We're only going to be exposed to higher and higher concentrations. The main source of CO2 is actually ourselves when we breathe CO2 in the air. And this is, I'm talking about indoor spaces, not outside, but indoors, the main CO2 provider is ourselves from when we respire. And that's why in meeting rooms, in small spaces, when there are lots of people, there can be associations with tiredness, grogginess, and it can reduce our cognitive performance and also our alertness, which is obviously really important at work. And that's what the graph on the right is showing there, a study where as the concentration of CO2 increases, how people's cognitive performance actually goes on. So CO2, there's also a debate about whether it's actually a pollutant itself. Of course, it's in terms of it's whether that the concentrations we're exposed to indoors, it could be classified as a pollutant for our health, and that's what's still under debate. It certainly can be at high enough concentrations, but are we commonly exposed to that? But there's a lot of evidence around the fact of the cognitive effects and the poor effects on our productivity, putting aside the potential health effects, which are still currently being researched. And then you've got nitrogen dioxide as well. So NO2, I'm sure we've all heard of, is a real important pollutant at the moment. It causes a lot of issues with respiratory systems over short periods and can aggravate asthma and lots of respiratory different illnesses. And it's linked to all sorts of things like increase in hospital admissions, longer exposures is even the development of asthma, and also a number of cancers associated with respiratory parts of the body. So really important pollutant. And again, it's predominantly produced by incomplete combustion. So from cars, but also from boilers, for example. So a really important pollutant to look at as well. So in terms of indoor air quality, there are numerous solutions. I think probably during COVID, I think we're all now much more aware that ventilation and providing fresh air in a space is really, really important. But alongside this, and one of these in our armory is plants and how they can improve the indoor air quality. So I'm just going to talk about that from my experiments now and what I actually did. So the CO2 experiments you see here, I've got a few pictures of actually undertaking them. The motivation behind this was that, as I've said before, that elevated concentrations can cause an array of health issues, increase workplace absenteeism as well, and have been linked with an increase in absenteeism, but reduced cognitive performance. So we wanted to see if houseplants act as a simple low-cost support, basically, to traditional ventilation systems and providing fresh air to a space. And the photos here, we did an array of testing. The one on the left is a testing at the leaf level with an infrared gas analyzer. So again, that's testing at a much more granular level. And then on the right, you've got an enclosed chamber, which is a good way of testing the plant for a short period of time without different environmental factors. And this is a chamber that enclosed one plant, because I have chambers that enclose numerous plants or can simulate rooms, for example. And in the middle there is how the CO2 is delivered. How did we deliver that elevated CO2 to measure? And that's through a cylinder. Sorry. So the key conclusions from the results were the fact that, as you can see on the right, this graph here, there's numerous different species tested. This is one of the graphs, and on the y-axis you've got the amount of CO2 removed. On the x-axis you've got the light level. So the key finding, and what's been found in other research as well, is the fact that the light level is really important for CO2. But there is numerous differences as well between the different species and how they actually perform. So at typical light levels, it found that actually houseplants, they didn't do a huge amount in terms of influencing room concentrations, and they also didn't increase the CO2 concentration dramatically either. And that's something that is actually a bit of a myth, in terms of it's often believed that plants respire a lot and actually release a lot of CO2 in terms of at normal light levels, and this didn't turn out to be the case. So we don't need to worry about plants increasing the CO2 concentration in a space. But for any significant removal, a high light level is required. So we found that a number of pea studies would be required, something like 10 within a space, to actually get hundreds or 200s part per million removal. And what's really important is the environmental conditions. That is the light level, substrate type, and the condition, if they're dry or wet species. Dry or wet substrate, sorry. And the substrate type, obviously there's numerous different types, and they play on how the plant works. And then you've got whether the soil is dry or wet. I think we anecdotally know that important to test whether, when plants are dried out, we often forget or potentially leave about them and they become dry. So how do they perform in that environment? But also, when I say wet there, that means optimally watered, as in not over watered, but how they perform when they're wet. So interesting results from the CO2. And again, that's mirrored by a lot of other research. In another way, NO2 actually had some really interesting results as well. I tested 3 different species, all of which were found to remove NO2, and we tested at the World Health Organization's guideline of 100 part per billion. So that's their short-term acute guideline for you shouldn't be exposed to more NO2 than that over a very short period. That can be very dangerous to you. So we tested those plants we tested these at typical indoor light levels. So we tested them in the dark at no lux, and then 500 lux, which is typical, in wet and dry soil and different substrate types. So on the right there is a summary of actually the best performing plant that we found, which is the ZZ plant, and that was at 500 lux in wet. But actually all plants at all light levels were removing NO2, which is quite interesting. So even in no light at night, NO2 was being removed, and more so in the day, but still at typical. So very different result from CO2, where you needed that increased light level. And we estimated that from our calculations that in a small office at that 500 lux in a well-watered environment, that 1 meter squared of a wall would remove 3 parts per billion per hour of NO2. So obviously that's a estimation and a short-term experiment, but interesting the fact that it was being removed. 3 parts per billion may not sound like a lot, but the long-term guideline is actually 20 parts per billion for NO2. So it's a significant removal, and it's something similar to what targeted policies have around low emissions and low NO2 concentrations, lowering that. So quite a significant result, and good to know that a number of plants are removing, probably all plants removing NO2 all the time. And interestingly, this plant, the ZZ, which I've got a photo of here on the left, is a succulent, and actually for quite an easy plant to keep. Doesn't require much watering, relatively easy to keep, and wasn't really what we were expecting would remove the most NO2. So just a summary on this, I just want to talk about the whole, all plants and indoor pollutants. So this plants have been shown to remove a wide variety of indoor pollutants, and to varying degrees, formaldehyde and benzene, for example, as well. So other pollutants that are really relevant to the indoor environment. The studies have shown that the species type, the environmental conditions are extremely important. So the light level, the amount of moisture in the soil, and the actual type of substrate used all really affect. But on a single potted plant level, you're not going to get a dramatic effect that's going to really reduce room level concentrations. But on the flip side of that, green walls, and especially active green walls, so for anyone who doesn't know what active is, it's where there is fans in the bottom of a green wall, and the sort of unfiltered air is drawn in from a space, and then it's drawn through the plant, through the substrate, through the plant, and then back out. And that's a sort of an active green wall. And studies that have been done on this have shown really good potential, almost similar to a portable sort of air filter that we have in spaces, really similar sort of clean air delivery rate. And obviously then you've got the extra benefits of how nice a green wall looks like, and all the other benefits that plants offer that a purifier does not. And a very similar energy amount, because it's just running a number of fans. So a really, really good positive result, but these green walls are very expensive. So we need more investment in them to do research on them, and also more made, the cost will come down, and we'll start to see them in more spaces. So there's certainly a lot of potential and still a lot of research to do in that area. And really on future research, I just wanted to have a look at some of the the air quality things I've seen that I think are pretty interesting coming out recently. So the photo on the left is from a colleague of mine who actually did my PhD Viva, and some research he did where he's using an active green wall there, so you can see the unfiltered air going in the fans, and it's being circulated through the ductwork, the filtered air, and into the space. Again, this is a really novel method and of actually delivering cleaner air and having the green wall within the space. And then you've also got on the right a really interesting study I saw where the underground parking is obviously, you can imagine, being an issue with NO2, and it's quite an unventilated space, so exhausting the air up through a chimney, and having a system of plants where they're able to then remove that before it goes into the outdoor atmosphere. And I thought that was some really interesting work being done there. So moving on from air quality now to discuss thermal comfort and specifically relative humidity. As I mentioned before, air temperature, not going to discuss, but plants also have a role to play there. But I think with relative humidity, we're probably all more aware now after coronavirus that keeping it within the optimum zone is really important. 30 to 60% is an optimal zone, and you'd say 40 to 60 is really the ideal zone that we expect. Outside of this area, as you can see from the table on the graph on the left there, you've got a lot of problems with viruses, survival, bacteria, even ozone production, respiratory infections. So keeping it in that optimum zone is really important. It's difficult to keep relative humidity within that zone because as we drive across the world towards more sustainable buildings, moving towards net zero carbon, humidifiers in buildings are really energy intensive. You can put them within a system that delivers the fresh air, but the energy use is really high. So it's really important to have passive solutions, and this is what plants can offer. Through transpiration, they release moisture into the air, and they require much less energy. And so for my experiments, I did a bit of work on this in terms of looking at how different species release different amounts of water into the air. And this is what is on the right here, as you can see. So species choice, again, is really important. It's important to consult an expert who knows what species do. In real studies, there's been really mixed results, some really good results and some bad in terms of, and I think the reason behind that is the controls of the experiments haven't been good enough. There's been tried to do it in real life, but too many other factors influencing the results, and that's given out some mixed messages. So again, this is an area where we really need to focus on, because I think relative humidity is going to be a really important one as we move towards more sustainable. How do we keep it within that zone? And I think plants also have a really important role to play within that. So I just want to discuss productivity and well-being as well, and how plants can help with that. So productivity is, as you say, a very wide-ranging word and a bit of a difficult to measure. In terms of how it's measured in experiments academically, it's usually done via test. So human intellect test on the computer, so some sort of written task, word association, filing, that sort of thing. And what the experiments do is they have different rooms with plants, without plants, and people take the same test. So the species is different. The number of plants, is it a wall of plants or is it just one pot plant, for example? And plants were found to significantly improve performance in certain tasks and improve attention span across the board. It was interesting that in certain tasks, they were consistently shown to improve, such as word association and filing, I think. And in other tasks, it didn't seem to make much of a difference. And there's no clear reason as to why that is. So again, this is more things that need to be looked at. And so productivity and measuring it is really important. At Cundall, we've got a tool where we're currently working on adding biophilia to this, where we're able to measure the productivity of the space itself. And the interesting thing about this is we're not measuring people's productivity. There's so many different factors, but it's about measuring the space of that. And we've created this tool to look at the thermal comfort so far. It looks at the air quality, the CO2 concentration, looks at the daylighting as well. And it can drill down into a percentage loss of basically how much the space is outside of the range that's required. So if the temperature is too high, if the humidity is too low, this program in Grasshopper can actually create that percentage. And the good thing with creating a percentage is the fact that can then be mapped to an annual salary, for example, of the floor. and you can then try and numerically map the losses in productivity, and that encourages people to add biophilia, to add different parts of well-being. So it's an important tool that we find is really interesting for clients. And that moves us on to well-being as well. So planting is a big part of the WELL. I said there's a WELL AP standard before. WELL is a building certification that's US based, but it's applied internationally to offices, to residential as well. So it's not just offices. And that has stipulations for the number of indoor and outdoor plants and the types of those, for example, and the percentage that are required. And that's really important because they know how it affects psychologically, how it's the mind and the well-being. And just speaking on well-being, it is a subjective measure, but academically it's usually measured via surveys. That's the best way it's done. And studies have found plants to show the reduction in stress, positive relationship between plants and participants, so people really like having there. Not well-being specifically, but again, it's a very subjective measure, and actually better to break down into stress reduction and things like that. And really interestingly, a number of studies have found that the placement of plants in sort of patients' rooms in hospital environments, post-surgery, have reduced recovery times, number of painkillers, for example, no amount of anxiety, amount of fatigue. So there's some really interesting stuff there that plants are doing, and these studies would be done with patients with plants, without plants, and I think with the same sort of operation. So there's some really interesting work, really great things that plants are doing. So that hopefully that gives a brief overview for everyone. Obviously, feel free to, there's a question section after that, but I'll hand back over now and stop sharing my screen. But thank you for your time, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gubb. I cannot turn my video back on, but that's okay. I am going to introduce our next speaker. Just a reminder, oh, there we go, I can open it now. If you have questions, please do go ahead and put those into the Q&A box so that we can have a lively discussion afterwards. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Marion Waller. Marion is advisor to the Mayor of Paris and Hidalgo and in charge of architecture, patrimony, urban landscape, green spaces, and funnery issues. She has previously worked for the Deputy Mayor in charge of urban planning, Jean-Louis Messica, and has helped deploy Reinventing Paris, the international call for innovative urban projects that was then exported to other European cities. She is an urbanist and a philosopher specialized in environmental studies and has published her first book in 2016, Artefacts Naturels, about ecological restoration and ways of re-inhabiting nature. She teaches urban controversies at Sciences Po Paris and environmental philosophy at the Université Paris, established in Université Paris. In 2021, she received the European Talent Award for Real Estate Professionals aged 40 or under by the Urban Land Institute. Welcome, Marion.
Hi, thank you for the invitation. I'm wearing my coat because it's very cold now in Paris. So, just one second. So, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today. So I will be talking about the policies that we implement in Paris in terms of both buildings and public space, and how this can interact with the ecological restoration of Paris and the fact of bringing more biodiversity into the city, so being on buildings or on the ground. That's a picture of Paris that I like because it reminds us that the image we have of cities is really an interaction between built and natural environments. And sometimes we present cities as essentially built environments, but I think what makes every city magic, Paris like other ones, is really this interaction, and in this case, it's interaction between the Seine River, which is at the center of our city, the trees and the built environments. And sometimes because we have a lot of controversies here in Paris, and when I hear some people saying that Paris is a mineral city, it makes me angry because I think that it's not a mineral city, it's really a mix of all those things that makes Paris special. So we were used to a double monoculture, which is the monoculture of the city and the monoculture of nature, meaning the fact that we think about cities as places that are almost entirely dedicated to human beings, and we think of nature as a place where human beings are sometimes not welcome, and as if it were two different entities. And I think it's very important to really break with those two monocultures and think of both cities and places like natural parks as hybrid spaces. So this is a map of Paris, which is the city of Paris is inside the white boundaries. It's a very small city compared to London or Berlin when we talk about really the administrative boundaries of inner Paris. And it is a very dense city. It's one of the densest cities in the world. That's a specificity of Paris, which makes the beauty of the city, but which also creates a lot of constraints. Because as you can see on the map, so when it's very red, it's very dense. We don't have much space left to transform the city, to create new buildings, or to create parks. We are in a very a complex environment where it's not easy to intervene, but it's also the case for other big cities. And so what we try to do is ecological restoration of the city, meaning we try to bring back biodiversity everywhere we can, being on the roof, on the facade, on the ground, along the river, yeah, everywhere we can. So one very emblematic project that was launched by Mayor Anne Hidalgo was the transformation of the riverbanks, and I want to start by that project because it has really launched a new way of doing urban planning in Paris. So this space was a highway dedicated to cars, and so she decided to transform it into a park. And this project is interesting because it shows how we can change a space in a sober way, not changing everything, but just replacing cars with people. And I think that's the beginning of ecological restoration. So now on both sides of the river, there is a space where people can go and play with their children, bike. They organize like children birthdays there. They can play soccer, skate, etc. And it's really a space that I love in Paris because all uses are possible. And when people go there, we can observe that they feel free to do what they want at any time. And I think it's very important to have free spaces like that at the heart of the city. And there are also, of course, boats, restaurants, etc. And dancing, of course. So that was really as I said, a big change in our urban policies. And we also wanted to intervene on the building environment because, as you may know, construction takes 50% of natural resources and produce 25% of carbon emissions. So the real estate sector has to go through a major transformation, and that's why during the last mandate we launched this competition called Reinventing Paris. And the idea was really to give incentives to the real estate sector to change their way of building and of renovating buildings. And for that, we chose 23 sites in Paris, very different sites. And we said that we would change the rules of the game, meaning that we would not sell those sites to the highest bidder like we used to do, but we would sell those sites to the best projects. So the 23 sites were chosen all around Paris with very different situations. Some were like all the buildings in the center. Some were wasteland along the ring road, and we wanted to show that innovation was possible in very different contexts in Paris. This competition had a great success because 372 projects were received, and on all the sites. And the architects and the developers were quite excited also to be able to change their practices. And of course, also with a lot of international teams and very different professions mobilized. And in particular, we wanted to open this urban game to the people working about urban agriculture and in general biodiversity in the city. So most of the teams actually included experts in urban agriculture. And so the main questions we wanted to ask were, first, how to foster innovation in a city which is mostly built. So how can we bring innovation and not changing everything? And how to extend the scope of urban commons, because we want every building to really bring general interest to the city. The idea was to create private buildings that would really be of public interest. That's why we call them commons, urban commons. And I will show you some of the winning projects. And it was really a call for projects and not a call for ideas. So the projects had to have a business model and to be entirely financed by the private sector. This first project, so there was an old railway, an abandoned railway station that you can see on the right of the picture, and we couldn't find like a project for this old building, so we said that people could build, could create a building beside and renovate the railway, and the winning project is called. It's about urban agriculture and food. So the entire building is dedicated to like a food transition with a food market with laboratories of a school specialized in agriculture with like housing units for chefs, and it will be really a center dedicated to that topic. And the building is made of wood, and and there is also a lot of vegetation. And I think this project really shows how we can mix old and new buildings in Paris. And the building permit has just been delivered for this project, so we are excited about the project being soon implemented. Another iconic project is called 1,000 Trees. So here the site was actually spaced above the ring road, and we wanted to show that it was possible to create different crossings, because the ring road is a huge barrier between Paris and the suburbs. And so here the building is a mix between building and forest. There are two forests, and the idea is really to cross from one city to another through a forest, and there will be actually 1,000 trees in this project. And so here the building permit has been delivered, but it's also being attacked in justice. That's life with projects in Paris. It's very difficult, but we are still confident. And I wanted to show a project that is already built. It's called La Ferme du Rail, so the railway farm. It's along a former railway track in Paris. And this project has been realized by like NGOs, and there was no developer. And it's a farm and like housing units for people who used to live in the street before. And it's really an amazing project made entirely of like local materials like wood, straw. and with this garden. And I think it's good to see that in Paris we can have different types of architecture and not only the Haussmannian architecture, you know. And we are very happy that this project was one of the first actually implemented. Another project that is already built, it's a housing project where the roof and the facade are quite have also been worked with experts in biodiversity and urban agriculture. And so on the rooftop there will be a shared garden for the inhabitants, and it's participatory housing, so they co-design their house. So yes, this one is also made with wood. And outside of that, we are really developing massively urban agriculture in Paris everywhere we can. What we do, we also organize frequently call for projects dedicated to urban agriculture. So when we have a public building with an available roof or space, or also private buildings that we integrate in our call for projects, and so we launch frequently those competitions so that the best agriculture project can actually use this space. And through that, we really helped also like a business ecosystem to develop about urban agriculture. And that, for example, is the roof of the Opéra Bastille, where there is an urban agriculture firm that is installed now, and that produces quite a lot of vegetables and fruits. So from this competition, we learned a lot, and we decided to really change the rules of urban planning in Paris. And now we are in the process of changing our urban rules, and we will really make some things mandatory. So the first thing is to change the recipe of buildings. So when there is a new building, we really want concrete to be replaced with biosource materials like wood, straw, or stone, because of CO2 emissions. And we help also the entire businesses to develop about those biosource materials. Second rule, buildings should create ecosystems. So now for every new buildings, we ask for also new green spaces to be created. So around the buildings and on the building, because since we are a very dense city, we need the private sector to help us reach those objectives. And of course, maybe the most important role is to use what's already there, meaning to not demolish buildings and to use existing materials. Then during the electoral campaign that was last year, we tried to think about what could be the future of like the typical urban spaces in Paris, because as I said, a lot of people think about Paris as a mineral city, and so we want to show that our patrimonial city is compatible with biodiversity, and that it's not a contrary things, but that we can really create a new landscape in our streets, in our boulevards, that is compatible with more biodiversity. So we try to imagine the future of some spaces. For example, that's a classical street in Paris with cars and buses in the middle, and then sidewalks for pedestrians and the buildings. And so we said, okay, if we remove some cars from those spaces, this classical street can become that. So a space where we plant more trees, and where we take the space dedicated to car parking and we transform it into terraces, into spaces for like services in the city, and for also kids to play. And of course, the idea is also to change in the middle of the street to make pedestrians and bikes prioritary to cars. And so of course, we won't do that in 1 year, but it's the image we have for our streets, that we know that there can be a new landscape that is compatible with our patrimony. The same for small squares, like we took this like classical street crossing in Paris, and it's the same with, if you take the car parking space, you can really create a small plazas, and so similar plazas could be created in a lot of different neighborhoods, and really create space for like conviviality and spaces for people to meet, which is very important in a big city like Paris. So like it can you can have 2 small gardens, a fountain, a lot of things can be done, and if you remove some cars from this space. And then this is a very important space, which is the school, because our mayor, she often says that the school is like the neighborhood capital space. So we want to center a lot of activities around schools in Paris. And for that, we took some important decisions. The first one is to remove cars from the streets around schools everywhere we can, because we think that children have to be safe around schools. Second thing is to transform schoolyards, because schoolyards are often only like mineral spaces, and so they are very hot also, and so we want to transform those spaces and to open those spaces during weekends, so that children of the school can enjoy those spaces, but also other people during the weekend. And of course, to use the roof if we can do urban agriculture. And yeah, that's very important for us, for like also citizenship, to create all those activities around school. So those are some examples of schoolyards that have already been transformed. And it's interesting to see how the image of the schoolyard can be changed from a mineral space to a more natural space. And I have visited some of those spaces, and it's really crazy how children enjoy those spaces, and especially in some very popular areas where, of course, they don't have gardens, and they can go there also during the weekend and play. And I visited this schoolyard, and the director told us that since there had been this new schoolyard, the children were actually not fighting anymore, because they are just enjoying this space. And these are other images. And so every schoolyard can become a garden, I think. And so, as I said, we are also massively transforming parking spaces, because we think that it's a huge potential inside the city. We don't have so many potentials, but this one is very important. And the mayor announced that she wants to transform half of parking spaces in Paris. So we launched a public consultation saying, what would you do with 10 square meters in front of your home? Because that's what a parking space represents, and we think that all those parking spaces can become gardens or terraces. And of course, the coronavirus crisis also helped us accelerate this movement, especially in terms of like cafes, restaurants that were developing terraces. And finally, I think that our priority as urban planners should always be to plan the city at the scale of the children, and that's really what we try to do in Paris. And I think that if we manage planning the streets for children, then we will plan the city for a lot of people, because this small scale really helps us putting human beings in the center rather than cars. And so that's why, as I said, we are actually closing all the streets in front of schools to cars. And on the right, it's an image of a project that is called La Rigolote, so like the fun street, that is actually realized for now several years by school parents. And every Friday, they close the streets to cars, and they just install like huge games for children. And when you see this space, it's really amazing, because you see how much one street can be used by many children, and how they can have like an extension of their small apartments and enjoy public space. So we will now, this summer, we are beginning the construction works on all the streets in front of schools, so that we can transform them into like gardens and spaces to play. And I think if we start by that, we will really be able to show that this new landscape with more biodiversity has its place in Paris, and that the city can be more beautiful and more lively thanks to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marion. So I have time for a couple questions. The first one, I can start my video. I'll just start that. The first one is for Curtis. Tim asks about return on investment, and what can you say to businesses about the return on investment they would get with bringing nature inside their building? Is there quantifiable things that you could share?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. In terms of quantifying all of this, it is rather difficult. I think I'll just start my video, sorry, you can see me again. So that's one of the reasons we tried to create that tool to try and quantify, and that can be used at sort of a due diligence stage, for example, when looking at different spaces when initially, and then also how that sort of impacts, you know, in we're using the tool and using POE surveys, how in a year, in 2 years time, occupants actually feel about the space. Because and productivity, then it's very difficult to isolate it to just planting and just say that that's planting and that's optimizing the productivity, and because people have so many numerous factors in their lives, and that's why I think it's really interesting and useful to just look at the space itself and do that. But things like the Well, which I mentioned before, and other building standards are pushing that forward, and there's been a mass uptake on those since coronavirus and since that, which help optimize health and well-being. So I think there is ways of doing it, but not a clear-cut answer.
Okay, great. And a question for Marion from Ingo. Can you speak to the Paris requirements? Are they mandatory? How do you implement them? How do you monitor it?
In terms of buildings, right?
The buildings, the green roofs, and all these different bringing nature into the building.
So it's a mix of mandatory things and incentives. So as I said, we are now changing our plan rules, so those rules are mandatory. It takes some time to change them, but our intention is really to make some things mandatory, such as the change in materials in the construction of buildings, the fact of reusing materials, and the fact, of course, of creating urban agriculture where it's possible, and to have green roofs and facades. It's already a bit mandatory when there are more than a certain number of square meters in Paris, but we want to reinforce those measures, and also we want to create more like neighborhood compensation. So meaning when there is a new building, that the developer pays for like new trees in the neighborhood, not on the building. And then we have a lot of incentives that we discuss for every project. We try to create also a negotiated urban planning, and for example, the competition Reinventing Paris was a way of giving incentives by saying that we would sell our public land only to like great and green projects. So yeah, it's a mix of rules and incentives.
And as a follow-up to that, Meg asks about the parking, and you're asking people to give up their parking spaces. Has other parking been provided, or are you really just having a transition away from the car?
So it's both. Our underground parking spaces are not full. So what we ask is people to go more underground and not to use the streets, because space in the street is so rare. We need it for people. So yeah, we try to create incentives so that people go underground. And then of course we are also pushing for a massive transition, meaning that we would like only people who really need a car to have a car in Paris, and we are providing alternatives for other people.
And I think one more quick question there for Marion too. There's asking about the maintenance of the schoolyard. I certainly thought about that as well. So how is that maintained and who's responsible?
So it's our service for green spaces that is responsible. And yeah, it's a good question because in fact our administration for green spaces, they said that it's a lot of work that is in addition for them, because before they used to take care only of parks, and now we are creating a lot of hybrid spaces. So it's not easy inside of the city of Paris, because then it's a mix between the people who are responsible for like street management and people who are responsible for park management. And now every street is also a park in a way, and schoolyards also. So we have to find like new ways of of working together among our services.
Great, and I think we have time. I'm going to squeeze one more in for Curtis. Can you maybe speak to some of the challenges or some of the unexpected things that you saw with trying to bring nature into buildings? And I say this because, you know, for example, in Toronto, we have green roofs and people wanted to bring agriculture on the roofs, but then we had a requirement where you had to have something over winter, and a crop doesn't overwinter. So I think it was a little bit of surprise that there was a lot of you know, challenge to actually bring, you know, food onto a roof, which you think would have been an easy thing. So maybe I was just wondering, has there been a lot of challenges or roadblocks or things that were unexpected policy barriers to overcome?
I mean, there is some stuff in terms of walls and fire problems, for example, especially externally and sort of planning things in London. But generally, I think there's not many restrictions. Most of the projects we work on have, and again, especially if they're well, have some sort of outdoor gardens, some sort of landscaped areas, for example, walls, and internally as well. Probably the main barrier for internal walls that I spoke of is cost. And how much they cost, and trying to quantify the benefits of that cost, and the other is space, the space for irrigation systems and that sort of thing, and obviously ideally you want to use grey water recycling to then irrigate the spaces, and that requires more space as well. So those are probably the biggest barriers, but I think in many projects they're easily overcome, and I think they really make it worthwhile. So worth persevering with.
Wow, thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Curtis. Thank you so much, Marion. Very fascinating. Certainly here in Toronto, I think this is a new world for us. We've been very fortunate to have, you know, 30% canopy cover already, and I think we've been taking nature a little bit for granted. But as our population grows, we're going to need to really go hard on some of these different initiatives that you're already adopting. So thanks for leading the way on that and being an innovative leader. I'm going to pass it back to Audrey, who's going to close off today's session.
Excellent. So thanks very much, Jennifer. Thanks very much to the speakers. Some fascinating insights and some really interesting questions and interest from the audience. So just to close, thank you all for attending this fourth session. AIPH is the world's champion for the power of plants. Through these briefings, we recognise the City of London Climate Action Strategy, which includes a commitment to providing thriving and biodiverse green spaces and urban habitats. So again, thank you for joining the session today, and I look forward to welcoming you all to the fifth session on the 14th of September, which considers the urban heat island effect and advances in the concept and practice of urban forests. We hope to see you there. Until then, farewell.